like to recognize that Acadia University is located in Mi'kma'ki, which is the traditional and unceded ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Hello, I'm Peter Ricketts, and I'm the President and Vice Chancellor here at Acadia University. And today, I'm delighted to be sitting with my good friend, Zabrina Whitman, who is the advisor on Indigenous Affairs to Acadia University. And in that role, she not only helps our students and our employees with issues related to Indigenous Affairs, but she also acts as a special advisor to myself as president. We are delighted to have Zabrina at Acadia. So Zabrina, we always say that we're all treaty people. And so as we're thinking about Treaty Day, what does it mean to you?
Well, Treaty Day is a really important day for me, but I don't think it's just an important day for me. I think it's important for all people. What Treaty Day is about, it was created in 1986. So in 1985, our treaty rights were recognized, specifically the 1752 treaty, and the year after, the Grand Chief declared Treaty Day on 1986. So every single year since 1986, we've celebrated Treaty Day on October 1st, and it launches Mi'kmaq History Month. And it's a big day for all of us for Mi'kmaq, but it should be a day celebrated by every single person in Nova Scotia. And the reason is it's celebrating not only that the Mi'kmaq were the original people here for over 12,000 years, but it recognizes the fact that there were treaties signed in the 1700s, started in 1725 or in the 1720s up to 1760-61, signed between the British and the Mi'kmaq. And why this is significant and why everyone should celebrate this day is that these treaties recognize that a nation originally existed in Nova Scotia and in Mi'kma'ki, and that people came to this land. And while there might be some disputes between us and we don't always agree how to manage things, the peace and friendship treaties were exactly what they're called. They're about coming together in peace and friendship and trying to figure out how we can coexist together despite having different backgrounds. So even though these treaties were signed in the 1700s, we still celebrate those today because they are affirmed and recognized in our courts, but it's also explaining that we are coexisting together in Nova Scotia and we have to learn to cohabitate and work together, and really that's what reconciliation is all about. So for me, Treaty Day is a significant day because it's highlighting that we are all treaty people and that there is a treaty relationship between the Mi'kmaq and other individuals in the province of Nova Scotia.
Yeah, and I think it is important because I think a lot of non-Indigenous people kind of view Treaty Day as something that Indigenous people celebrate. But a treaty is between two parties, right?
Exactly.
And so, for me, as somebody who immigrated to Canada from England, when I look at a treaty like that, and I think, that is a treaty that bound, my country as it was then with the Mi'kmaq people, and that continues today and has been, as you said, upheld by the Canadian court. So this is not something that disappeared when Confederation happened, and this is something that both Canada and the Mi'kmaq people, and here in Nova Scotia, the province of Nova Scotia, are committed to. We should all be celebrating it.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think that's the challenge with individuals looking at Treaty Day. They think it's just a Mi'kmaq celebration or a Mi'kmaq holiday, but it isn't. The Mi'kmaq are celebrating it because it's important to us, but it should be important to everyone else. And I know that there's treaty education, which is out of the Department of Aboriginal Affairs for the provincial government, that's trying to create education on this and remind people that we're all treaty people. But I think this day is really important for everyone to try to celebrate in Nova Scotia because of its significance. And I know people will say, well, these treaties were signed with the British Crown, they weren't signed with us. Well, our leaders, our chiefs also signed them on behalf of people. That's why we have people who represent us in government as well. So even if you don't feel that you signed it, that's normal with treaties. It's a relationship between two different nations, and that's what it's about.
But also, the British Crown is still the head of state of Canada. and the Constitution Act of 1982 incorporated those treaties as part of the Constitution of Canada. If it wasn't obvious, in the original British North America Act, it certainly is under the Constitution Act, which is why the Supreme Court of Canada has come down with very important opinions on the recognition and the validity of those treaties and what they mean in today's world. But in some ways, part of the issue we've got, isn't it, is trying to determine, well, what does a treaty that was signed, in 1760, what does it mean now? How do you interpret that, and how do you apply it? And what are your thoughts around, that context as we come together and try and see what that treaty means in the modern day?
I think our treaties, they're really unique to the rest of Canada, the peace and friendship treaties, because they are exactly that. In peace and friendship, we didn't cede anything, we didn't give anything up. They're not modern day treaties or comprehensive claims treaties that were done out west, like in BC and up north. So what we're doing in Nova Scotia is saying we do not want to touch or change what is within our treaties because they're perfect the way that they are. But we have to figure out how they will work for today, and that's what negotiations were all about. And Gwilma-Maglusawaking Negotiation Office was established after an umbrella agreement was signed to try to determine how do we implement what our treaty rights actually look like. And so what was created, for years we were having challenges with the federal government, or I'll say the Crown in general, about how do we actually implement these rights, because we said we don't exist within what's called the comprehensive claims process. So in Nova Scotia, what was born was the rights reconciliation approach, and it was presented to the Trudeau government. And they've taken it across Canada, but really it's unique to Nova Scotia, and the application that we're doing is saying, okay, because we're not going to touch these treaties, what we're going to do is figure out how we can implement them for short time periods and work for whatever the short time would actually look like, and see how it can work for today's society. So I think that's what's really important, is that negotiations today is saying, okay, let's take the foundations of what's within these treaties and see how they can be applied to today. So how can we coexist together? How can we ensure that we recognize Mi'kmaq ways of thinking and governing equal to that of the mainstream society? And that's what we're trying to do today with the negotiation process, although there are challenges at times depending on the government department you're dealing with.
Yes, and in Canada, the history of fisheries management is full of confrontation and dispute and trying to deal with very, very difficult issues. And of course, and that's because you're talking about people's livelihoods. And so when you're talking about their livelihood, people do get upset and they get sensitive. I think, one of the interesting things about this is that in many ways, the Mi'kmaq people's livelihood was taken away from them completely. And in some ways, what we're trying to do, I think, with reconciliation is get back to where some of that livelihood is given back, and dealing with that can be very difficult, of course. So as we have a current situation with the fisheries, which is occurring right now, and it's creating some hostility and division and bad feelings. As we look at Treaty Day and we think about peace and friendship, what's the message, do you think, for how the negotiations should now go forward?
For negotiations, I'll leave that to the actual negotiators with how they think it should actually go forward. But I think with the fishery situation, it all gets down to education and respect and engagement. And I think the challenge is it's a very complex situation. People in general on both sides aren't fully informed about what our rights look like. So in 1999 was the Donald Marshall Jr. case. It was a Supreme Court decision that affirmed or recognized that the 1760-61 treaty was valid and that we have a moderate livelihood to hunt and fish. However, moderate livelihood was hasn't been defined, and that's what we're trying to determine. Moderate livelihood is somewhere between communal fishing and commercial fishing. And it's been difficult to figure out what that means because the Department of Fisheries is a challenging department to work with. I think both the Mi'kmaq and non-Mi'kmaq feel that way. But with the current situation that's happening, I think the challenge that we're having with that is, or I think what we need to do with that situation is ensure that people just openly are able to communicate. And I think that's the big message from there, is that people all need to be around the table and having conversations on these issues. So it's a Mi'kmaq right, and people have to understand that this is a Supreme Court decision and that these rights are affirmed. At the same time, we need to communicate and make sure that the general public is informed on these things that are happening around the table. And I think that's the key message about what reconciliation is really about in general, is that there's things that people are unaware of or don't understand, and they're scared to ask certain questions. Maybe because it wouldn't be politically correct, or they just don't have the opportunity to, or they don't feel that they're in a safe space to ask those types of questions. But I think in order for us to move forward in terms of a relationship for reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, we actually need to be able to have those open and frank conversations and be mindful that some things might not be said that's always comfortable, but that's the only way we can move forward. For those types of relationships. In terms of the actual negotiation process that's happening with fish, that will be left to all of those beautiful parties to determine, and I wouldn't want to be sitting at that table.
But you mentioned education and respect. So what do you see as the role for universities in this whole process of not specifically on the fisheries side, but more generally on truth and reconciliation, and in fact being party to this Treaty of Peace and Friendship?
So I think it all goes back again to the Peace and Friendship treaties, and what they're about is that there is a treaty relationship and an acknowledgement that there's equal value in our ways of thinking and our ways of being and our governance structures. And one of the institutions or the bodies that are the most difficult to get through in terms of recognizing and supporting that are universities. And I think the challenge people don't always understand is that our ways of thinking are as valid. So I always use the two-row wampum belt philosophy, that I'm in my canoe and you're in your canoe and we're going down the rapids and the river together. I'm not going to tell you how to steer your boat. You're not going to tell me how to steer mine. But together we're moving along the path as allies or joined together. So that's really what reconciliation is about, and that's what it's important for academic institutions to understand as well, is that especially when we talk about our ways of thinking, maybe we don't measure knowledge in the same way as the Western world, but it's still as valid, and our governance structures are still as valid as well. So we can speak for ourselves. We don't need other individuals to speak on our behalf, and that it's important for, in an academic settings, to be able to work with us to figure out how we can move forward on issues related to Indigenous peoples, but also recognize that there's space in Western institutions for non-Western thought as well.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of Acadia specifically, we have incorporated a strategic plan that we've begun working on, and there's a significant Indigenous piece within that strategic plan. And we've made a lot of progress. We've done a lot of things. We fly the Grand Council flag. We give the land recognition, and of course your appointment is a critical part of that. But as we move forward, how would you like to see it go deeper into the institution as we really, start walking or maybe canoeing down this path or this river of truth and reconciliation? What are some of the things you'd like to see happen in the near future?
I think the biggest thing, but it's a long-term goal, is working on how we can decolonize our minds, so in decolonize educational spaces. So at the end of the day, we know, I've always said this, I'd love to see a school of Indigenous solutions at Acadia. That's what I think would be the most value, is creating spaces that doesn't just provide value to Indigenous students, but says how can we learn in a different way and in a different context than we're currently doing, because that's the challenge, is not everyone learns in the same way, and academic institutions, especially universities, are set up for a certain type of learner, and it deters different individuals from wanting to pursue it, especially Indigenous people. So we need to create spaces that are more welcoming so that people feel that they fit in these spaces. And I know one of the biggest challenges I've had, or not challenges, but one of the biggest things I've tried to do is expose youth to the campus at an early age so that they know that these spaces are welcoming and they're supposed to be here. And it's been great because we've done it through sports and activity, but at the same time we need to make sure that there's actual foundational institutional change that can support them as well, so that there are people on campus that are Indigenous that they can relate to. So when I say that, just not me in my role, but we have faculty as well, that we have courses focused on Indigenous studies or Indigenous ways of learning, including in the sciences, because the way we approach looking at science is different, and that the campus itself feels like an Indigenous space, because one of the biggest things I've heard from Indigenous students from outside of Mi'kma'ki is that when you come here, you don't realize you're in Mi'kma'ki, even though we know that this is the space of Glooskap. When we look at Bloomington, it doesn't have anything that really looks like an Indigenous culture, as opposed to when you go to BC, for instance. Every space, there's a lot of Western, like BC Western First Nation art and architecture, and we don't have that. So that's important too, to just even feel that from the ground up, it's a welcoming space for Indigenous peoples, and it acknowledges where we actually are.
Yeah. So what's your great hope now for moving forward? If Treaty Day 2020, in the midst of a pandemic and in the midst of the economic and the social fallout of that, people have a lot of things on their mind. Some of the bigger issues of the day have been sidelined a little bit. We think about climate change. Climate change is still happening. But the big stories of the day are focused on the pandemic and how we're responding to that. And as we sort of move out of that, how can we make sure that important issues like Treaty Day, or the issues that Treaty Day raises, don't get pushed aside as well? And because it's easy to say, well, we're thinking about it now because there's some problems, but we want to be able to be dealing and thinking about this when there aren't problems, or when there aren't things that bring it to a head. So what do you think when you look forward and say, maybe that we can use the current experience that we've had with the pandemic as a benefit as to how we address our relationships between Mi'kmaq and non-Mi'kmaq people, for example?
Yeah, I think moving forward, as long as we're always at the table, we won't be forgotten about what needs to be discussed. So what I mean by that is that it goes right back to reconciliation. As long as Indigenous peoples are at those decision-making tables, then these things won't be there's a hot topic right now, we should make sure to discuss this issue. It will always be at the forefront, or it will always be an aspect of conversations. It will just be ingrained into conversation, and I think even the strategic plan is doing that. It's not saying we're going to target specifically Indigenous people or Indigenous students. We're just going to use Indigenous concepts as a part of our strategic plan. So I think when we start integrating Indigenous ways of being into our everyday, then we don't have to specifically look and try to remember that there are specific dates that we have to be mindful of, whether it's Treaty Day, whether it's Orange Shirt Day, which is what I'm wearing right now, which is September 30th, for the acknowledging all of the children who died in residential schools and honoring that. We won't need to be doing all of that, but I do hope that we get to a point someday where, despite disagreeing with one another and not sharing the same viewpoints, that we can do it in a respectful manner, because the environment we're in currently, it's never okay to be violent, it's never okay to be racist. And the fact that I have family calling me scared that their children are going to be taken away from them and put into residential schools again, because people have currently put out a petition in Nova Scotia to send us to residential schools again, is not okay. So when we can get to a time period where we can have respectful dialogue instead of actions like people are doing right now, and realize that that's what conversation is about, is we can have disagreement, then I know we're at a good place.
I mean, another issue that's particularly on our minds right now is the whole issue of anti-black racism. And of course, that again was raised in the media because of bad things that happen, right? It seems you have to have bad news to get people's recognition and awareness of these things. And yet, some of the things that we've just been talking about and what you've been saying, these really apply across the board, don't they? I mean, they're not, yes, there are very specific Indigenous issues, but a lot of the issues you're referring to, people from other disadvantaged groups or minority groups or whatever might feel, oh yeah, I identify with that. So, again, how do we try and build those kinds of dialogues between different groups to make sure that we're including everybody in this path forward?
That's why I always say, like, the treaty relationship, or our treaties, even though it's specific between the Mi'kmaq and the Crown, really it can be applied to relationships in general. And that's what I say about reconciliation as well, is that while that's a hot term for working with Indigenous peoples or coming out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what it's saying is that you have to value all people and other people's ways of being, and that we need systemic change, whether it's for Indigenous peoples, when we look at the Black Lives Matter movement for Black lives, whether it's for accessibility, the LGBTQ Two-Spirited Plus community, and for any other individual or groups that feel that they are being excluded or not at the table. So I think what Indigenous peoples are saying in terms of models for engagement and for conversation can be applied for other situations or for other groups as well. And that's what, again, reconciliation and relationship building is all about, is taking value from each other's ways of being and trying to incorporate it into your own way and seeing what's valuable from another culture and bringing it in. And that's what Canada is really founded on anyways, is it's a mosaic of different cultures and societies and ways of thinking. So we just need to apply that to non-Western ways as well. I know that I was talking about why Treaty Day is significant for me and for Indigenous peoples in Nova Scotia, but I do want to hear from someone who's non-Indigenous why it's significant to you, or is it significant?
Well, I think for something to be significant to you, you've got to know about it first, right? And I think part of the issue that we face, particularly those of us who are non-Indigenous, non-Mi'kmaq, is just simply being aware of the fact that there is a treaty day, and then being aware of what it means. So it comes back to what you were talking about, education, right? If people aren't educated about something, how are they going to recognize what it means to them, let alone what it means to anybody else, right? So I think the first step is sort of recognizing why Treaty Day is important to you and to Indigenous people generally, and then reflecting on what that means for me as a non-Indigenous person. And so, from my perspective, it as I mentioned earlier, because I immigrated to Canada and I'm British, to me, a treaty with the British Crown means something, because the Crown, whether you agreed with it or not, at the time it represented everybody that was under the jurisdiction of the Crown. So that and because that passes forward to today, that includes me as much as it includes everybody else in Canada. So part of it is learning my responsibility under that. And again, that comes back to education. If you don't know what a treaty was about, why would you think that you have any responsibility to act it out? It's just something that was negotiated between two people a long time ago, and it doesn't mean anything today. So from that perspective, Treaty Day for me is an opportunity to raise awareness and try and spread education, and to get people thinking about why is this important. And as president of a university, and because I see a university as having such important roles in society for education, yes, but also for raising awareness and for getting people to think about different things that are not part of their perspective. The reason we ask students to come here to Acadia is because we actually want them to step out of their comfort zone, of their own environment, and come here and mix with different groups of students and with professors, and really start thinking about different perspectives. And so Treaty Day is an opportunity for us to say, this is something that's really important in not just the history of our country, but in the present day. And it also helps to explain some of the issues that we're talking about in class, or that you're seeing on the news. And that to me is very, very important. The other reason it's important to me is because of our strategic plan, and because, we recognized that we need to do much better as a university and as a community in being more open and inclusive and diverse, and that we also need to do much, much better in recognizing the special relationship of Indigenous people. And so, to me then, the Treaty Day is a way to get people thinking about what that means, not just as a strategic plan. So it's like the treaty, treaty is a treaty, but if it doesn't say something to you on a day-to-day basis, it's not going to be important. So the strategic plan is the same thing. If we can get everybody thinking about why something in that plan is important to them, then it takes on far greater meaning. And so one of the things that we're trying to do right now is the establishment of an anti-racism task force. And so this is another way of perhaps using a moment in time, and in this case, spurred, but not only about the Black Lives Matter, but using that as a moment to educate people, to make people more aware, more understanding, and hopefully start building those bridges that lead to reconciliation. And that to me is why days like Treaty Day are really important, because we can use them as educational platforms.
And another question though is, how do we actually get at some of those real systemic changes that we need to make? Because I think people are becoming educated, they're informed about what we should do, but it seems like even people who are informed say, okay, that's great, but, so in an instance when we were looking even here at Acadia, people will say, yes, for instance, we need more Indigenous faculty, but I need someone in my department first that fits this requirement. So at the end of the day, we're still not overcoming some of the systemic barriers that we have. So what is your idea of how do we actually overcome that in institutions, especially at Acadia?
Well, I think, these barriers, they need to be addressed by us rethinking how we do things. So, they're only barriers because of the way we have always done certain things. So the way we hire professors, for example. If we're going to change those, break down those barriers, then part of it is saying, well, maybe we have to rethink the way we actually practice these things, because it's those practices that probably created the barriers in the first place. Or maybe the practices just reinforce the barriers that existed in society anyway. So as society changes, and we want society to change for the better, we need to be prepared to look very closely at what we do and the way we do things, and say, just because we've always done it that way, and that's the way academia does things, is that necessarily the way it has to be? And if you do things a different way, will that lead to the end of the world? Or actually would it produce something that we're trying to see and trying to be see as beneficial for the university and for the university community? And ultimately it comes down to the kind of educational environment we're providing for our students. So, if students from around the world come to Acadia, to Nova Scotia, and not realize they're in Mi'kmaq, and not realize that, and never meet an Indigenous person, or if they do, they have no idea they have met them because, they just aren't aware. And sometimes, people are, reticent about necessarily telling everybody about their background and their culture and their history. Then we've kind of failed as an institution if we're sending students out of here and they have no idea what the original peoples were, and that in fact they're still here.
Yeah, exactly. That we don't still live in
They
teepees.
still have they have rights, and that we share those rights and we share those experiences. So that to me is, what's really important, because about a university education is about preparing students to be able to go out and change the world. And how do you change the world if you think everything's fine?